A widowed millionaire saw a woman who looked exactly like his late wife and decided to follow her. When she stopped walking and turned around, the millionaire fainted at what he saw. The night fell upon the Aldridge mansion like a veil of black silk as the guests of the charity dinner arrived in their luxurious cars. Annalise, at 35 years old, her brown hair always tied in a severe bun that accentuated her angular features, adjusted for the 10th time the red dress she had chosen especially for that night. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched her reflection in the upstairs hallway mirror, her green eyes so similar to her sister's, revealing a bitterness cultivated by years of envy and resentment. Why did she always have to be the main star? She muttered to herself, her fingers clutching the small party bag. Since childhood, Caroline has always been the center of attention, and I've always been just Caroline's elder sister. The sound of laughter coming from downstairs made Annalise approach the stair railing. Down there, Caroline, at 32 years old, shone in a midnight blue dress that accentuated her natural beauty. Her golden hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her smile lit up the room as she welcomed the first guests. Dorian, her husband, a tall and elegant 40-year-old man, watched her with evident adoration, that same look Annalise had always longed for herself. He should have been mine, thought Annalise, her nails leaving marks on her palms. If she hadn't shown up at that party 10 years ago, Dorian would have noticed me first. The little Caleb, Caroline and Dorian's son, ran across the hall in his little suit, drawing smiles from the guests. At just 8 years old, he was the perfect mix of his parents, Caroline's green eyes and Dorian's charming smile. Annalise watched as Caroline gracefully bent down to adjust her son's tie, whispering something that made him laugh. "Mum, you're the most beautiful of all," Caleb exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And you, my love, are the most elegant gentleman at this party," Caroline replied, her melodious voice echoing through the hall. The orchestra began to play a soft waltz, and Annalise saw when Dorian extended his hand to Caroline, leading her to the center of the hall. The couple danced in perfect harmony, as if they were born for each other. Annalise felt the bitter taste of bile rise to her throat as she remembered how Caroline had casually appeared at that New Year's party, exactly when Annalise had finally mustered the courage to try to meet someone new. She knew I was going to look for someone that night, Annalise thought, her face contorting into an expression of pain. Caroline always knew I wanted to get married. How dare she do it before me? The ancient Ming Dynasty porcelain vase, a wedding gift from her parents to Caroline, gleamed under the chandelier lights, strategically positioned on its pedestal near the stairs. Annalise had always hated that vase, just as she hated everything that symbolized her parents' preference for Caroline. I remember when Mum said it was an inheritance for the daughter who looked most like her, Annalise whispered to herself, her gaze fixed on the object, as if I wasn't also her daughter. Caroline began to climb the stairs, her heels echoing softly on the marble. She had noticed her sister's disturbed look and, as always, came to try to fix things. Her genuine concern for Annalise only made everything worse. Reaching the top, Caroline gently touched her older sister's arm. "Annalise, you look beautiful tonight. Why don't you come downstairs and join us?" "There are several of our friends asking about you," Caroline said, her gentle tone laden with concern. "Come have fun with us too, don't stay here alone." Caroline's touch burned Annalise's skin like acid. Years of resentment overflowed into her words. "Beautiful. You think you can console me with empty compliments? It's always been like this, hasn't it? The kind Caroline so concerned about the poor older sister." Annalise took a step towards her sister, her voice trembling with contained rage. "Do you have any idea what it's like to live in your shadow? To be compared to you at every moment of my life?" Caroline took a step back, finally realizing the intensity of the hatred in her sister's eyes. Her ever-serene face showed genuine concern. "Annalise, you're scaring me. I never wanted you to feel that way. We're sisters, we should be together, supporting each other," Caroline tried to argue, extending her hand in a gesture of peace. "Please, let's talk about this. We can work out anything together, like we always have." The sound of music and laughter coming from downstairs seemed to mock Annalise. Her hands trembled as she approached Caroline, who was now dangerously close to the first step. "Work it out? How do we work out the fact that you stole the only man I ever loved? How do we work out a lifetime of being everyone's second choice? Annalise practically spat the words. You knew I loved Dorian. You knew. Caroline shook her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. What do you mean, loved Dorian? What are you saying, Dorian and I? But before she could finish, Annalise advanced. Don't you dare speak as if you deserved him, she shouted, her hands finding Caroline's shoulders. You don't deserve anything you have. The next moment seemed to happen in slow motion. Annalise's hands pushed Caroline with all the force of her accumulated hatred. The younger sister's body stumbled backward, her arms flailing in a futile attempt to regain her balance. In the fall, Caroline tumbled down the stairs until she hit the pedestal of the Ming vase, which fell on top of her. The sound of shattering porcelain mingled with Caroline's muffled scream. Annalise watched, paralyzed, as the blood began to spread across the white marble floor. Caroline's once perfect face was now covered with deep cuts caused by the shards of porcelain. For a moment, Annalise felt a wave of panic, but soon her self-preservation instinct took over. With quick, calculated movements, she disheveled the stair carpet, creating the scene of an accident. A discreet smile forming on her lips, Annalise grabbed her phone and began to dial for emergency. Before that, however, her voice rose in a desperate scream that echoed throughout the mansion. Dorian, help! Caroline fell! As she waited for the hurried footsteps that were already approaching, Annalise gazed at her sister's disfigured face, a feeling of morbid satisfaction taking over her being. Now we're equals, dear sister, she whispered, as she heard the emergency operator's voice on the other end of the line. Finally, you're not the prettiest one anymore. Hurried footsteps were climbing the stairs, and Annalise quickly composed her expression into one of horror and concern. Caroline remained motionless, the blood forming a scarlet halo around her face, while the party music continued to play softly in the background, an ironically cheerful soundtrack for the tragedy that had just unfolded. Please, hurry. Annalise spoke into the phone, her voice choked with false tears. My sister, she fell, there's so much blood, she said, sounding desperate. Hours later, the white, sterile hospital corridor seemed endless as Dorian paced back and forth, his hands nervously running through his already disheveled hair after hours of waiting. The elegant suit he had worn at the party was now wrinkled, and dried bloodstains marked his white shirt. Caroline's blood, his Caroline's. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. Please, God, he muttered repeatedly, his voice choked with contained sobs. Don't let her leave me, not like this, not now. Caleb slept restlessly in one of the waiting room chairs, his small body curled up under his father's coat. His angelic face occasionally contorted into expressions of distress, as if even in dreams he could sense the gravity of the situation. Annalise watched the scene from across the hallway, her green eyes calculating every move, every expression. So much like her, she thought, a bitter taste rising in her throat. But if all goes well, soon it will be just you and me to console Dorian, little Caleb. The sound of the family doctor's shoes echoed down the hallway before he even appeared around the corner. Dorian immediately straightened, his red, swollen eyes fixed on the approaching figure of the professional. The doctor's grave expression made Dorian's heart sink even before the words were spoken. Mr. Aldridge, the doctor began, his voice heavy with the burden of the news he was about to deliver. We did everything in our power, but the injuries were too severe. Dorian's reaction was visceral. His knees buckled, and he would have fallen had it not been for Annalise, who, coincidentally, was close enough to support him. Her delicate hands gripped his arms with enough strength to keep him upright, while her body pressed against his in a way that could seem innocent to any observer. Dorian, dear, be strong, she whispered, her melodious voice laced with false concern. Caroline would want you to be strong now. The sound of his wife's name seemed to awaken something in Dorian. He disentangled himself from Annalise's embrace and staggered closer to the chair where Caleb slept. His hands trembled as he touched his son's shoulder, hesitating to wake him and deliver the news that would change their lives forever. How will I tell him? Dorian muttered, tears streaming freely down his face. How do I tell my son that his mother, that Caroline? Caleb awoke to his father's touch, his sleepy eyes quickly filling with understanding as he saw the tears on Dorian's face. With a wisdom beyond his years, the boy threw himself into his father's arms, both sharing an embrace filled with pain and loss. Annalise watched the scene with a mixture of irritation and triumph, her mask of sadness occasionally slipping when she was sure no one was looking. "Soon this pain will pass, Dorian," she thought, adjusting her expression. "And I'll be here to help you forget it." The following hours passed in a blur of hospital formalities and necessary phone calls. Annalise took on the role of the family's pillar of strength, organizing everything with an efficiency that impressed everyone but Caleb. The boy watched his aunt with a distrustful gaze, noticing how she touched his father more than necessary, how her voice changed when she spoke to him. "Daddy!" Caleb called out at a moment when they were alone. "Aunt Annalise is different. She's scaring me." Dorian was too lost in his own grief to fully process his son's words. Annalise, however, heard everything from the doorway, her eyes narrowing dangerously toward her nephew. She approached Caleb with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dear, your aunt is just trying to help," she said, her honeyed voice hiding a veiled threat. "After all, we're a family now, aren't we?" The sun was beginning to rise when they finally left the hospital, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the sadness they carried. Annalise drove Dorian's car, insisting he wasn't in any condition to do so. Occasionally, her hand would absent-mindedly touch his leg as she shifted gears, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Caleb in the back seat. Mom wouldn't like this, the boy thought, his small hands clenching into fists. She always said she and Dad were a loving couple. The Aldridge mansion looked different in the morning light, as if the tragedy of the night before had altered its very essence. The remnants of the interrupted party were still everywhere. Half-filled glasses, abandoned coats, wilting flowers in the arrangements. Dorian stepped out of the car like a man in a trance, his eyes fixed on the staircase where Caroline had fallen. "She was so beautiful yesterday, so happy," he murmured, his voice broken by emotion. "How can everything be so different now?" Annalise quickly linked her arm through Dorian's, guiding him away from the stairs. Her body pressed against his in a way that could seem comforting, but there was something predatory in her movements. "Let's go inside. You need to rest," she said, her voice low and seductive. "I'll take care of everything, of all of you." Caleb remained in the car for a few more moments, his eyes roaming the garden his mother had loved so much. It was then that he saw her, a female figure dressed in black, walking near the gate. The boy's heart leapt when the woman turned slightly, and for a brief moment he swore he saw his mother's profile. "Mom?" he whispered, his nose pressed against the car window. "Is that you?" But when Caleb blinked, the figure had disappeared, leaving only the swaying lilies as proof of her presence. The freshly cut grass swayed subtly, along with the white petals gently fluttering in the morning breeze. "Caleb!" Annalise's voice cut through the air, making the boy jump. "Come inside now. We can't leave your father alone at a time like this." Caleb stepped out of the car slowly, his eyes still fixed on the spot where he had seen the mysterious woman. The flowers remained there, a silent enigma in the morning garden. As he walked inside, the boy felt his heart grow lighter, despite the sadness. Something deep within him told him that it was his mother, no matter what his father said about her having gone to heaven. "I know it's you, Mom," he thought, a small smile forming on his lips. "And I know you'll come back to take care of me." From the living room window, Annalise watched her nephew playing in the garden with growing irritation, her eyes narrowing as she noticed a shadow moving gently between the trees. The sight stirred in her a mixture of discomfort and anger, as if each laugh from the child echoed in her ears, mocking her frustration. Something about that scene disturbed her deeply, but she quickly brushed the feeling aside, shaking her head as if to dispel an unwelcome thought. "They don't know what it's like to live in someone's shadow your entire life," she muttered softly, feeling the familiar wave of resentment rise like a tide within her. Annalise trailed her fingers along the arm of the green velvet chair where Dorian used to sit, her gaze now fixed on the garden. "Now it's my turn to have it all," she whispered to herself, with a determination that had not only been born in that instant, but had been building over years of silent bitterness. Her face hardened as her mind wandered through the moments when her sister Caroline had been the star, the favorite, the one praised by all. Caroline, the devoted mother, the perfect wife, the ideal heiress. Always Caroline. Dorian always only had eyes for Caroline. I was the forgotten one, the one no one noticed. But now no one will stop me from getting what I've always wanted. Annalise pressed her lips together, a dark glint in her eyes. I've spent so much time waiting for my moment, hidden, ignored, being the one no one cares about, the one who accepts the crumbs. Well, it's over. From the depths of her mind, childhood memories welled up with force. Her mother's gentle voice always calling for Caroline, the constant praise for her sister's achievements, while Annalise in the corner was merely a shadow, the older sister no one bothered to listen to. Even Dorian, the one who should have been her husband, had married Caroline, and now, even dead, it was Caroline's name that remained on his lips, as if she were irreplaceable. But Annalise knew that no one was irreplaceable. If she had done everything right, I wouldn't be here now taking her place, Annalise whispered, more to herself than to the emptiness. She rose from the chair, walking slowly toward the window, her fingers still trailing across the velvet as if absorbing strength from the gesture. Outside, her nephew was still crying, oblivious to the whirlwind of hatred that was seething within Annalise. She narrowed her eyes again. Her time is over. Now it's my turn, and I won't let anyone, not even that child, take it away from me. The next day, the grey sky of late afternoon seemed to weep along with those present at Caroline Aldridge's funeral. The closed casket covered in white lilies, her favourite flowers, rested on the marble stand, while a fine drizzle began to fall on the attendees. Dorian stood firm, like a statue, his face a mask of contained grief, as he held Caleb's small hand. The boy had not shed a single tear throughout the entire ceremony, his green eyes, so much like his mother's, fixed on the casket with a disturbing intensity. "She's not in there," he whispered so low that only his father could hear. "Mum wouldn't leave us like this." The scent of roses and vanilla, Caroline's signature fragrance, wafted through the air even before Annalise appeared. She had found her sister's favorite perfume bottle and wore it generously, as if she could somehow occupy the space left by Caroline simply by carrying her scent. Her steps were soft on the wet grass as she approached Dorian and Caleb, her black dress hugging her curves in a calculatedly modest way. "Dorian, dear," her voice was poured honey, "let me stand by your side. You need all the support you can get now." The priest continued his ceremony about eternal life and divine comfort, but his words seemed empty in the face of the unfolding tragedy. Caleb observed his aunt's movements with growing discomfort, noticing how she drew closer and closer to his father, how her hands seemed to find any excuse to touch him, even as the father struggled free, lost in his own thoughts. His mother's perfume she wore made his stomach churn. "Why is she wearing Mommy's perfume?" he thought, his small hand gripping his father's tighter. "It's as if she wants to be Mommy." The final words of the ceremony were pronounced, and those present began to approach for the final condolences. Annalise organized everything with impressive efficiency, directing people, accepting condolences, always keeping a possessive hand on Dorian's shoulder, her voice occasionally trembling with perfectly rehearsed tears. "Caroline was more than my sister," she told everyone who approached. "Now I need to be strong for Dorian and Caleb." Dusk began to tint the sky as the last guests departed, leaving only the family before the casket that would be lowered into the ground. Caleb remained motionless, his eyes now fixed on a distant point between the gravestones in the cemetery. Dorian finally let his own tears fall, the sound of his crying breaking the heavy silence. "How will I go on without you, my love?" His voice was but a broken whisper. "How can I raise our son alone?" Annalise immediately moved to embrace him, her body molding to his like a second skin, Caroline's perfume enveloping them in a sickly fog of falseness. But something in the scent, so familiar and yet so wrong coming from her, made Dorian recoil sharply. His eyes, previously clouded with grief, now shone with sudden clarity. "Why are you wearing her perfume?" His voice had an accusing tone that made Annalise freeze for a moment. The boy's words fell like bombs in the silence of the cemetery. Dorian, still lost in his own sorrow, merely hugged his son tighter, interpreting his words as the outburst of a traumatized child. "Caleb, son, it was a terrible accident," he murmured, his voice choked. "Your aunt is just trying to help us." Annalise felt her blood momentarily run cold at her nephew's words, but she quickly regained her composure, forcing a condescending laugh. "Poor thing. He's so traumatized he's making up stories." As Dorian headed for the car, Annalise's sweet smile transformed into something predatory, her green eyes, so much like Caroline's, taking on a dangerous glint. She approached Caleb, crouching down to his eye level. "No one will believe a disturbed little boy traumatized by his mother's death," she whispered, her voice now devoid of any pretense of kindness. After all, children tend to make up stories to deal with trauma, don't they? Annalise then hurried her steps, catching up to the boy's father with ease and leaving the child behind. Suddenly, her expression quickly returned to a mask of concern and sadness. "Dorian, dear, he's simply confused. We must be patient." Her voice returned to its previous syrupy tone. "Perhaps it's best we take him home now. It's getting late and the poor thing must be exhausted." The drive back to the Aldridge mansion was made in heavy, tense silence. Caleb refused to sit in the back with Annalise, clinging to his father in the driver's seat. As the car ascended the mansion's driveway, the boy looked up at his window on the second floor, and his heart stopped for a moment. There, perfectly visible against the light of the room, was a female silhouette. The figure moved slightly, and Caleb could briefly see his mother's face before she disappeared from the window. The car came to a stop in front of the mansion, and when Caleb looked back at the window, the figure was gone. But he could still feel her presence, like an invisible, protective embrace. For a moment, Caleb wondered if his aunt was right, if he wasn't traumatized and seeing things he shouldn't. "Let's go inside," said Annalise, her tone false. "It's getting dark." Night fell over the Aldridge mansion like a heavy cloak of stars, the silence broken only by the distant sound of crickets in the garden. Caleb remained awake in his room, his eyes fixed on the window where earlier he had seen the figure that so resembled his mother. The boy hugged the last present Caroline had given him, a small book of tales she used to read to him before bed. His fingers caressed the worn cover as his mind relived every moment of that fateful night. "I know what I saw," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling slightly in the darkness. "I think Aunt Annalise hurt Mommy. I'm sure of it. I always thought she was evil." Annalise wandered the mansion's hallways like a restless shadow, her fingers occasionally touching the objects that belonged to her sister. A photo frame here, a vase there, as if trying to erase Caroline's presence and replace it with her own. She still wore her sister's perfume, a sickly cloud of roses and vanilla that seemed to haunt her. Her steps led her to Caleb's bedroom door, where she paused, listening to her nephew's whispers. A cruel smile formed on her lips as she pushed the door open gently. "Can't sleep, dear?" she asked, her voice falsely sweet. "Auntie can keep you company." The boy shrank back against the headboard, his green eyes so much like his mother's, shining with a mixture of fear and anger. His small hands gripped the book tighter, as if he could use that last piece of his mother as a shield against Annalise's malign presence. "Get out of my room," he shouted, his childish voice laden with a courage that surprised even himself. "You took my mommy away from me. I know it was you. I miss my mommy. You don't have to stay here anymore," the boy accused, unsure of what he was saying, merely following his childish instincts. Annalise's mask of sweetness slipped for a moment, her eyes glinting dangerously in the dimness of the room. With 3 long strides, she crossed the room and grabbed Caleb's arm with enough force to leave marks. The book fell to the floor with a dull thud as she dragged the boy out of the room. "So you want to talk about your mother?" she hissed, her tone now completely different from her earlier docility. "Let's talk about her, dear nephew." Caleb tried to break free, his small feet barely touching the ground as Annalise dragged him down the hallway towards the main balcony of the mansion, meters above the ground. The cold night air hit his face as she flung open the French doors with a violent shove. The stars shone indifferently in the dark sky, silent witnesses to the unfolding cruelty. "Please, Auntie," Caleb pleaded, tears beginning to stream down his face. "You're hurting me." "Hurting?" Annalise laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed across the empty balcony. She pushed Caleb towards the railing, forcing him to look down at the garden 3 floors below. "Want to see your mother? She's down there, you know. Just take a little step and jump." Her hands gripped the boy's arms, forcing them open like wings. "Come on, little bird, your mother is waiting for you down there." The night wind ruffled Caleb's hair as he struggled, but Annalise's grip was too strong. She leaned him further and further over the railing, her body pressing threateningly against his back. "You want your mother back so badly," she whispered in his ear, her voice dripping venom. "Then go find her. Just take a step forward. She'll catch you, I promise." Silent tears streamed down Caleb's face as he squeezed his eyes shut, praying that this was just a terrible nightmare. His mother's perfume, worn by Annalise, seemed to choke him, making everything even more surreal and terrifying. "Mommy," he thought desperately, "please help me. I know you're here somewhere." In the garden below, shadows danced under the moonlight, creating shapes that seemed to writhe and twist. Annalise gripped Caleb's arms even tighter, leaning him a little further over the railing. "Look down there," she ordered, her voice now almost sing-song. "Isn't it beautiful? Your mother fell too." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Annalise's heart leap. With the agility of a snake, she completely changed her demeanor, pulling Caleb into an embrace that could seem loving to any unsuspecting observer. Her face transformed into a mask of serenity as she pointed up at the starry sky. "Look, dear, that's the constellation Orion," she said, her voice now sweet and instructive. "Your mother loved watching the stars with you, didn't she?" Dorian appeared at the balcony door, his haggard face showing signs of worry. "Caleb? Annalise? What are you doing out here so late?" Annalise smiled sweetly, her fingers pinching Caleb's shoulder in a silent warning. "Oh, Dorian. Caleb couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd show him the constellations. Caroline always said the stars calmed her." Dorian approached slowly, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and grief. "Son, you should be in bed," he said gently, reaching out for Caleb. The boy ran into his father's arms, visibly trembling, but Dorian, in his state of weariness and mourning, interpreted the shaking as coldness. "It's freezing out here," he murmured, holding his son protectively. "Let's go inside, it's past your bedtime." Annalise watched father and son walk away, a cruel smile playing on her lips as her hands caressed the balcony railing. The moon illuminated her face, revealing for a moment the true predatory nature that lurked behind her mask of kindness. "Sleep well, dear nephew," she whispered to the night, "and remember, accidents happen so easily in this house." In the hallway, Caleb clung tighter to his father, his small body still trembling with terror from the ordeal he had just endured. The boy kept his eyes squeezed shut, silent tears rolling down his cheeks as he whispered a prayer his mother had taught him. The night wind blew through the hallway windows, carrying with it the faint scent of roses from the garden, the same fragrance his mother had loved so much. "Mommy," he thought, his heart aching with longing and fear. "If you're watching over us from heaven, please protect us. Auntie Annalise is different, and I'm so scared." The days dragged on at Aldridge Manor like slow shadows over a stopped clock. Caleb was sitting on the floor of the room that had belonged to his parents, his little fingers tracing the outline of a photograph where Caroline smiled, radiant in her summer dress. Tears silently ran down his face as he held the frame against his chest. Her perfume still lingered in the closet's clothes, but now it mingled with Annalise's, who insisted on wearing her sister's things. "Mommy," he sobbed softly, his voice choked with longing. "Why did you have to go away? Why did you leave me alone with her?" Dorian found his son in that position, and his heart tightened at the sight of the evident pain on the boy's face. He sat down next to him on the floor, pulling him into a tight embrace. Caleb nestled in his father's arms, still holding the photograph as if it were his most precious possession. "She used to sing to me every night," the boy said between sobs, his little hands clutching his father's shirt. "Now I can only hear Aunt Annalise's voice, and it's not the same. She tries to look like Mum, but she's not her, Dad. She's not her." From the bedroom door, Annalise observed the scene with a mixture of anger and jealousy. She had spent the last hour arranging her belongings in the closet that had once belonged to her sister, trying to erase every trace of Caroline. But Caleb's cries echoed through the house like a constant reminder of her presence. Her nails dug into her palms as she heard her nephew talk about his mother. "Always you, Caroline," she thought bitterly, her eyes fixed on the photograph in the boy's hands. "Even dead, it's still you." The phone rang, cutting off the moment between father and son. Dorian answered with a weary sigh, his face growing serious as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Problems at the office demanded his immediate presence in the city. He looked at Caleb, then at Annalise, who quickly composed her expression into a mask of solicitous concern. "I'll take care of him, Dorian," she offered, her melodious voice laden with false sweetness. "You've spent too many days away from work and need to resolve several issues. Caleb will be safe with me." Night fell over the manor like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a disturbing stillness. Caleb refused to sleep, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door, fearing the moment Annalise would appear. His small hands were clasped in prayer, repeating the words his mother had taught him. "Guardian angel, my little mother," he whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling slightly. "Please don't let Aunt Annalise hurt me like she did to Mom." The sound of Annalise's heels echoed down the hallway long before she opened the bedroom door. Her face was contorted in an expression of barely contained fury, and Caroline's perfume, which she insisted on wearing, seemed even stronger and more suffocating. "Still crying for your mother, dear nephew? You never stop talking about her all the time, reminding your father of her all day long?" she asked, her voice laced with a cruelty she no longer bothered to hide. "So let's go visit her. How about that?" Before Caleb could react, Annalise grabbed him forcefully by the arm, dragging him out of bed. The boy tried to struggle, but she was much stronger. "Please, Aunt," he pleaded, stumbling as she pulled him down the stairs. "It's dark outside, I want to stay here." Annalise only laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed through the empty house. "But, darling, weren't you missing your mother so much? I'm taking you to her." The car raced through the night at high speed, with Annalise driving recklessly down the deserted streets. Caleb was huddled in the back seat, his arms hugging his own body for comfort. The cemetery came into view, its iron gates casting sinister shadows under the moonlight. "We're here, my love," Annalise announced with a manic glee in her voice. "Time for a family reunion." The stones of the path hurt Caleb's feet, clad only in his bedroom slippers, as Annalise dragged him among the headstones. Caroline's grave, still covered in fresh flowers from the countless friends who adored her, loomed before them like a monument to Annalise's cruelty. She pushed the boy against the cold headstone, her smile now completely insane. "You want your mother so badly? Then you can sleep here tonight, dear nephew." Caleb tried to run, but Annalise grabbed him by the hair, forcing him to kneel before the grave. "Look closely," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "This is where your precious mother is now. And do you know why? Because she had everything that should have been mine. My advice is for you to stop reminding everyone of her all the time. Use this night to get over your longing." With a rough motion, she shoved the boy, making him fall onto the flowers decorating the grave. The sound of the cemetery gate closing echoed like a death sentence. Annalise waved from the other side of the bars, her silhouette outlined against the moonlight. "Sleep well, darling," her voice floated to him, laced with malice. "Tomorrow, if you're still alive, maybe I'll come back to get you." The sound of her heels faded away, followed by the roar of the car's engine as it drove off. Caleb huddled against his mother's headstone, silent tears streaming down his face as the darkness of the cemetery seemed to close in around him. The night wind whispered among the graves, bringing with it sounds and shadows that made his heart race with fear. "Mommy," he sobbed softly, his small hand touching the golden letters that formed Caroline's name. "I'm so scared." In the darkness between the gravestones, a figure began to materialize. At first, Caleb thought it was just another shadow playing with his frightened imagination. The cold wind of the cemetery made the dry leaves dance among the tombs, creating sounds that seemed like distant whispers. The boy huddled even closer against his mother's cold gravestone, his small body trembling with fear and cold. "Daddy," he sobbed softly, hugging his own knees. "Mommy, someone, please help me." The sound of soft steps on the grass made his heart race. The figure kept approaching, its silhouette cut against the silvery light of the moon, but Caleb was too terrified to look, burying his face between his knees as he murmured the prayers his mother had taught him. Suddenly, an elderly lady walking through the cemetery to visit her husband's grave found Caleb huddled and trembling next to Caroline's gravestone. His eyes, red from crying so much, could barely stay open, and his thin pajamas were covered in dew from the cold night. The lady approached cautiously, her heart aching to see a child in such a state. "My God, little one, what are you doing here alone?" she asked, her gentle voice breaking the morning silence. Caleb, remembering Annalise's veiled warning, swallowed his sobs and muttered, I missed my mom and came to visit, but I got lost." The boy was trembling so much that the lady took off her own coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. Caleb knew he needed to choose his words carefully. Annalise had made it very clear what would happen if he told the truth to someone. "My house is in the city center," he whispered, giving the address of his home and trying to control the tremor in his voice. He didn't need to say anything else. The kind lady was already on the phone, calling a taxi. The journey back to the Aldridge mansion was made in silence in the back seat of the taxi. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the window, his small body still trembling, not just from the cold but from fear of what Annalise would do when she found out he had managed to get back home. If I tell the truth, he thought, his hands clenching into fists, she'll hurt my dad too. I need to protect him like Mom would. Dorian was in a panic when the taxi pulled up in front of the mansion. He had returned earlier from the office and found the house empty. When he saw Caleb get out of the car, he ran to hug him. The lady briefly explained that she had found the boy in the cemetery, but before she could ask more questions, Caleb quickly intervened. "I really missed Mom, Dad," he said, his voice choked with tears that weren't entirely false. "I just wanted to see her. I'm sorry." The following hours passed in a blur of concern and gentle scolding from Dorian, who couldn't really stay mad at his son in the face of such a display of missing his mother. Annalise still hadn't appeared, which was a temporary relief for Caleb. The boy endured the hot bath and forced breakfast with a single mission in mind: to protect his father from the terrible truth about his aunt. "I promise I won't do this again, Dad," he repeated, whenever Dorian started to question the details of the previous night too much. "I just wanted to be close to Mom." When he finally got a moment alone, Caleb took refuge in the mansion's library, his favorite place where he used to spend hours reading with his mother. The afternoon sun lazily entered through the tall windows, creating golden patterns on the Persian rug. The boy settled into his favorite armchair, with a storybook that Caroline used to read to him, trying to calm his still racing heart from the events of the previous night. "Why does Aunt Annalise hate me so much?" he thought, his small hands gripping the pages of the book. "Why does she want to hurt us like this?" It was then that the first waft of perfume reached him, not the artificial version that Annalise wore, but the real scent that his mother always had, a delicate mixture of roses and something else, something that was uniquely Caroline's. Caleb looked up from the book, his heart starting to beat faster. The perfume grew stronger, as if someone was slowly approaching from the shadows at the back of the library. For a moment, the fear that it might be Annalise playing tricks on him made his body freeze. A figure emerged from the shadows, wearing a dress that Caleb would recognize anywhere, his mother's favorite, blue as a summer sky. Her hands, so familiar and yet different, reached out towards him. "Son." The voice was exactly as he remembered, soft as silk, laden with love and longing. Caleb's heart seemed to want to leap out of his chest. Part of him wanted to run and throw himself into those arms he knew so well, but another part was paralyzed, remembering Annalise's threats, the constant fear that was now a part of his life. "It can't be real," he thought, his hands trembling. "She died, Aunt Annalise said she died." But then the figure took another step towards him, and the perfume that no one, not even Annalise, could perfectly imitate, enveloped him like an embrace. The book slipped from his hands as he finally gave in to the urge to run to her. Tears blurred his vision as his small arms wrapped around his mother's waist, feeling the soft fabric of the dress, the real warmth of her body. It was her, really her. Not a dream, not an imagination created by longing, but his mother there, alive and breathing. "Mommy," he sobbed against the dress. I knew you would come back." The moment of happiness was brutally interrupted by the unmistakable sound of Annalise's heels echoing down the hallway. The sound seemed more menacing now than ever, like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds before an explosion. Caroline reacted instantly, moving with silent grace toward the heavy velvet curtains. "Don't say a word," she whispered quickly. "Promise me, Caleb. It's not time yet. Be strong just a little longer." Caleb barely had time to wipe his tears before the library door swung open with a threatening creak. Annalise entered like a venomous shadow, her green eyes scanning the room with predatory precision. She looked paler than usual, as if she too had spent the night awake, but her posture still carried that veiled threat Caleb knew so well. Her steps ceased abruptly in the middle of the library, and her nostrils flared, catching the scent that still lingered in the air. The boy pretended to be absorbed in his book, though his fingers trembled as he turned the pages. He could feel Annalise's gaze burning his skin, searching for signs of something wrong, something out of place. "What perfume is that?" Her voice cut through the silence like a razor. There was something in her tone, fear perhaps, that Caleb had never heard before. Annalise began to pace the library like a caged animal, her heels marking each step with menacing precision. She drew nearer to the curtains, where the scent seemed stronger. "It's impossible," she muttered more to herself than to Caleb. "I made sure myself. She couldn't." Her hands trembled slightly as they reached for the heavy velvet. Caleb watched the scene with his heart in his throat, torn between the terror of seeing his mother discovered and a strange satisfaction at the growing fear in Annalise's eyes. The curtains swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and the scent of roses now filled the entire room, impossible to ignore or deny. It was as if Caroline was marking her presence, defying the sister who had tried to take her place. Annalise was now inches from the curtains, her pale hands poised to draw them back. The afternoon sun filtered through the heavy fabric, casting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe, mocking her. "Caroline?" Her voice came out as a frightened whisper, almost a plea. The scent of roses grew stronger with every passing second, enveloping Annalise like a silent accusation of her crimes. Annalise took a step back and began to pace the hallways like a caged beast, her heels marking each step with growing fury. Caroline's perfume, the real one, not the imitation she had tried, still lingered in the air, taunting her, chasing her. Her hands shook as she flung open bedroom doors, rifled through closets and every nook of the house, searching for an explanation. "Impossible," she muttered repeatedly, her voice laced with a mix of anger and fear. "You're dead, Caroline." I made sure of it myself. The master bedroom was the first target of Annalise's frantic investigation. She ripped dresses from the closet that had once belonged to her sister, flung jewelry to the floor, ransacked every drawer searching for some sign that would explain that lingering scent. Her movements were frantic, almost manic as she destroyed the meticulous organization she herself had created in the past few days. "Where are you hiding?" she shouted to the empty room, her voice echoing off the walls. "How are you doing this to me? Are you going to try to haunt me now?" Caleb watched from his bedroom doorway, his small body trembling at each sound of destruction coming from his parents' room. He knew he should be in bed, pretending to sleep, but fear kept him alert. His green eyes, so much like his mother's, followed Annalise's every movement down the hall. "She's going insane," he thought, his heart racing. "Mama, please protect me." Annalise's fury drove her to the attic, where boxes of memories were violently torn open and their contents strewn across the floor. Old family photos flew like leaves in the wind as she obsessively searched for something she didn't quite know what. The dust kicked up by her frantic hunt danced in the air, mingling with that unmistakable perfume that seemed to grow stronger by the minute. "You're playing games with me, aren't you, Caroline?" she whispered to the shadows. "You were always better at making me look crazy." It was as she was returning from the attic that her eyes caught movement from Caleb's bedroom door. The boy tried to hide, but he wasn't fast enough. In 3 long strides, Annalise reached him, her fingers closing like claws around his arm. "What do you know?" she hissed, her face twisted into a mask of fury. "You saw her, didn't you? Where is she?" Caleb tried to break free, but Annalise's grip was too strong. She dragged him down the hallway, stopping at each door, each room, forcing him to look inside. "You're hiding her somewhere," Annalise accused, her voice quivering with rage. "You were always her boy, never liked me, did you? You must be helping her, aren't you?" The study was Annalise's next target in her frantic search. Still holding Caleb with one hand, she used the other to knock books from shelves, rifle through papers on Dorian's desk, scour every possible nook and cranny. The scent seemed strongest here, as if Caroline had just left the room. "Where did you hide her?" Annalise shouted, shaking Caleb. "Tell me, where is your mother?" The tears streamed silently down Caleb's face as he was dragged from one room to another. His thoughts went to his mother, hidden somewhere in the house, and he prayed that she remained safe. "I don't know anything," he managed to say between sobs. "Mom is dead, you said so yourself. You're the one wearing her perfume." The library was the last room to be searched. Annalise practically threw Caleb into an armchair as she began her methodical hunt. The perfume was stronger there, just like earlier. Her hands trembled as she pulled books from the shelves, looked behind paintings, checked every possible hiding place. "You can't be alive," she repeated over and over, I saw you with faint, vital signs. I saw your destroyed face. It's impossible." Caleb watched in horror as his aunt destroyed his favorite place in the house. The books his mother had loved so much now lay scattered on the floor, their pages open like broken wings. The boy hugged his knees, trying to make himself as small as possible, wishing he could disappear. "Why didn't you just leave?" he thought, his eyes fixed on Annalise. "Why didn't you just leave us alone?" Moonlight streamed in through the library's tall windows, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Annalise suddenly stopped her frantic search, her body tense as a cord about to snap. Caroline's perfume was stronger than ever, filling every inch of the space. "You're here," she whispered, slowly turning in a circle. "I can feel you." The heavy velvet curtains stirred slightly, as if touched by a non-existent breeze. Annalise advanced toward them, her eyes shining with an almost manic intensity. Caleb held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. "No," he thought desperately. "Please don't let her find Mom." A metallic sound, almost imperceptible, cut through the tense silence of the library. Something small and shiny fell from behind the curtains, tinkling softly against the hardwood floor. Annalise froze, her eyes fixed on the object now glistening in the moonlight. Caleb recognized it immediately. It was his mother's favorite earring, the one she had been wearing on the night of the accident. The world seemed to stop for a moment, as Annalise slowly bent down to pick up the earring. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it again. It was undeniable. This was the earring Caroline had been wearing the night she died, the same one Annalise was certain should have been buried with her sister. "How?" Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "How is this possible?" Caleb watched, paralyzed, as his aunt held the earring up to the light, as if searching for any sign that it was a copy, a fake. But there was no denying it. It was his mother's earring with all its unique characteristics, including the small scratch on the back that Caroline had always said gave the jewel personality. The scent of roses seemed stronger now, enveloping the library like an invisible embrace, and for a moment Caleb swore he saw a shadow move behind the bookcase. The first rays of sun had barely begun to touch the horizon when Annalise dragged Caleb downstairs to the living room. Her nails left red marks on the boy's arm as she shoved him toward the fireplace. The earring she had found in the library was now in her pocket, an uncomfortable proof that needed to be eliminated along with any other evidence of Caroline's presence. Annalise's eyes had a feverish, almost insane gleam as she ignited the fire with jerky movements. "You're going to help me end this once and for all," she hissed, her words cutting the air like razors. "We're going to make your mother disappear completely." With quick, determined steps, Annalise began bringing Caroline's belongings that she had collected during her frantic search of the house. Dresses, shoes, books, photos, everything was piled unceremoniously next to the lit fireplace. The fire crackled as if protesting what was about to happen, its flames casting dancing shadows on the living room walls, creating an almost surreal scene. Each object carried a piece of Caroline's life, fragments of a story Annalise was determined to erase. "Take it," she ordered, throwing Caroline's wedding dress, the dress from her marriage to Caleb's father, into the trembling boy's arms. "Throw it in the fire, now!" Caleb clutched the dress to his chest, his tears falling silently onto the fabric that still held a faint trace of his mother's perfume. The familiar scent seemed to embrace him, bringing a wave of memories he wasn't ready to let go of. His small hands refused to release the garment, as if holding onto it could also preserve the love and care Caroline had given him. "Please, Auntie," he pleaded, his voice choked with sobs. "Don't make me do this. These are the only things left of Mum. It's from Mum and Dad's wedding. She loved looking at this dress." Annalise leaned forward, her hardened face coming dangerously close to Caleb's. "Don't disobey me, boy," she hissed, snatching the dress from his hands with a violent motion. "Your mother is dead, and these things only serve to bind us to the past. It's time to move on." Without hesitation, she tossed the blue fabric into the flames. The dress twisted as if alive, its vibrant colors yielding to the heat as Caroline's perfume mingled with the smell of smoke. Annalise watched with a sick satisfaction as the tangible memories of her sister were consumed. "Now the next one," she demanded, forcing a pair of shoes into Caleb's hands. He hesitated, his little fingers trembling as they touched the soft leather his mother had once worn. The sight of the shoes brought flashes of Caroline dancing with him in the living room, laughing and twirling as music filled the space. "Auntie, please," he whispered again, almost inaudible. But Annalise showed no mercy. "Throw them," she shouted, her voice cutting. The stern tone made Caleb shudder, and with a heavy heart, he let the shoes slip from his hands into the fire. Each item Caleb surrendered to the flames seemed to take a piece of his soul with it. Photos where Caroline smiled, letters she had lovingly written, little gifts she had carefully chosen for him, all succumbed to the heat, turning to ash. Caleb wept silently, his tears wetting the carpet, as Annalise muttered in disdain, "So that cursed smell will be gone for good." The ritual seemed endless. Every time Caleb looked up at his aunt, he saw only the cold, unforgiving expression of someone who seemed incapable of compassion. As the pile dwindled, the sun was already high, but the day's brightness brought no relief to the boy. Annalise now held a jewelry box, filled with pieces Caroline had treasured. With a triumphant smile, she began tossing the items into the fire, one by one. The precious metals warped, the sparkling stones lost their luster, and everything was reduced to nothing. "See," said Annalise, her voice laden with a sickly joy. "Nothing of her is left. Not even that irritating perfume will haunt us now." She seemed to savor every word, as if destroying Caroline's legacy was a personal victory. Caleb, however, looked at the ashes in the fireplace and felt as if something inside him had been burned too. To him, it wasn't just the loss of objects. It was the destruction of a bond he could never regain. Annalise turned to Caleb, her eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "Now you understand, don't you? Caroline is no longer here, and there's nothing she left behind that can tie us down. We're free." But as she said this, Annalise failed to realize that in trying to destroy Caroline, she had planted in Caleb the seed of silent resistance. It was then that something in the large mirror above the fireplace caught her attention. For a moment, just a fleeting instant, Annalise swore she saw Caroline's reflection standing behind her. Annalise's heart stopped for a second, her smile freezing on her face. With a sharp motion, she whirled around, expecting to find emptiness. But the perfume was there, that same rose scent no amount of burning could erase. The air around her seemed heavier, denser, as if someone had just passed through. Caleb watched with wide eyes, his small body trembling not just with fear, but with a strange hope. Annalise began to spin in place, her eyes scanning every corner of the room for the source of that presence she could feel, but not see. Her hands shook as she pushed furniture aside and swept curtains away, desperately searching for something that would prove she was merely imagining things. "You're dead!" she screamed at the air. "I saw you die!" The fire in the fireplace seemed to dim for a moment, as if a sudden breeze had passed over it. The ashes of the burned belongings danced in the air, creating strange patterns before settling on the marble floor. It was then that Annalise noticed something that made her blood run cold. Amidst the scattered ashes, distinct footprints of a woman, as if someone had just walked through them. Caleb held his breath as he saw the prints. They were the exact size of his mother's feet, with the same delicate shape he knew so well. The prints started near the fireplace and trailed off down the hallway, like an invisible path left by a ghost. "Impossible," Annalise whispered, her voice shaking. "You can't be here." The morning sun now streamed fully through the living room windows, illuminating the destruction Annalise had wrought. The ashes still floated in the air like tiny black snowflakes, settling on the furniture and floor. But it was the footprints that dominated everyone's attention. Impossible, inexplicable prints that seemed to mock Annalise's every attempt to erase Caroline from existence. Annalise approached the prints with halting steps, as if afraid they might come alive at any moment. Her once triumphant face now showed a mixture of fear and disbelief. The prints were perfectly defined, every curve and detail exquisitely visible in the ash. Irrefutable proof that someone had been there, watching her desperate bid to destroy Caroline's last remnants. A gentle breeze wafted in through the window, making the curtains sway softly. With it came that familiar rose scent, stronger than ever, filling every corner of the room like a living presence. Caleb watched his aunt with a mixture of dread and satisfaction as she finally began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, some things couldn't be simply burned and forgotten. Annalise backed away a few steps, her face pale as wax as she stared at the prints on the floor. The fire in the fireplace had dwindled to only a few embers, but the heat emanating from them seemed insignificant compared to the chill now running down her spine. The ashes continued to dance in the air, as if moved by unseen hands, and for a moment it seemed to everyone that they could hear the soft rustle of a dress moving down the hallway. The night had settled over the Aldridge mansion like a heavy cloak of silence. Dorian remained in his office, immersed in papers and documents that demanded his attention, in a desperate attempt to keep his mind occupied and away from painful memories. The only light came from the lamp on his desk, creating a golden circle that barely illuminated the pile of contracts in front of him. His eyes burned with fatigue, but the fear of nightmares kept him working. "One more report," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from so much silence. "Just one more and maybe I'll be able to sleep tonight." The clock on the wall showed almost midnight when the first waft of perfume reached him. It was not the imitation Annalise wore. Dorian knew the difference well. This was Caroline's true scent, that unique blend of roses and vanilla that always announced her presence. His fingers froze on the laptop keyboard, his heart suddenly accelerating. "I'm going crazy," he thought, passing his hands over his tired face. "The longing is making me imagine things." The perfume grew stronger, as if someone had just passed by nearby. Dorian remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, fearing to look up and find only emptiness. The air in the office seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. A soft rustling of fabric broke the silence, like the sound of a dress brushing against the carpet. When he finally mustered the courage to raise his eyes, his heart stopped. There, standing in the office doorway, was Caroline. She was wearing the same blue dress she loved so much, her silhouette outlined against the darkness of the hallway. The shadows partially covered her face, but Dorian would recognize that posture, that slight tilt of her head, anywhere in the world. Caroline. His voice came out as a trembling whisper, laden with disbelief and hope. Time seemed to have frozen, as Dorian watched the figure of his wife. She did not move, did not speak, merely remained there, like an apparition between the world of the living and the dead. The scent of roses now filled the entire office, so real and present that Dorian could almost taste it in the air. His hands trembled as he slowly pushed his chair back, fearing that any sudden movement might make her disappear. Memories of the night of the accident flooded his mind, the sound of the breaking vase, the screams, the blood on the white marble. But the figure before him showed no sign of that violence. Caroline looked exactly as before, as if she had simply gone out for a walk and had just returned. "My love," he whispered, finally finding the strength to stand up. "Is it really you?" Dorian took a hesitant step towards the door, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard throughout the house. Caroline remained motionless, but something in her posture subtly shifted, as if she too wanted to draw nearer. The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken emotions, with unanswered questions. "I knew you would come back," he murmured, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I felt I hadn't lost you." It was then that Annalise's shrill voice cut the moment like a sharp knife. She appeared in the hallway, talking loudly on the phone, her presence a violent intrusion into the almost sacred scene unfolding. Yes, of course we can reschedule the meeting," she was saying, her artificial voice echoing off the walls. "Dorian has been so busy lately, you know how it is." The second Dorian took to divert his gaze from Caroline and look at Annalise was enough. When he turned his eyes back to the office doorway, she had vanished. The space where his wife had stood seconds before was now empty, but the scent of roses lingered, like a silent proof of her presence. Annalise stopped talking on the phone, noticing the disturbed expression on Dorian's face. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice forcedly sweet. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Dorian stumbled back to his chair, his legs too weak to support him. His hands trembled as he tried to light a cigarette, something he had promised Caroline he would stop doing. Annalise approached, her own perfume, that cheap imitation of Caroline's, struggling to dominate the room. "You need to rest," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're working too hard." It was as Annalise turned to leave the office that she noticed something strange in the hallway. In the dim light of the sconces, wet footprints marked the dark carpet. They were feminine footprints, small and delicate like Caroline's. They began exactly where the figure had been standing and followed the hallway towards Caleb's room. Annalise felt her blood run cold as she followed the trail with her eyes. The night wind blew softly through the open windows, making the curtains dance like white ghosts in the darkness. The wet footprints glistened in the moonlight, each one perfectly formed, as if someone had just passed by. Annalise approached the first mark slowly, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. She crouched down to touch one of the footprints, her fingers trembling. The mark was real, wet and cold, as if someone had just emerged from a long walk in the rain. The hallway seemed longer and darker than usual as Annalise followed the trail of footprints. They continued, relentless, towards Caleb's room, each mark a silent accusation of her crimes. The scent of roses still hung in the air, growing stronger with every step she took, as if she were following not just footprints, but Caroline's very spirit. When she reached her nephew's bedroom door, Annalise could swear she heard the soft sound of a lullaby, the same one Caroline used to sing to Caleb every night. Dorian arrived home from work hours later, when night had settled upon Aldridge Manor like a heavy cloak of silence. The vastness of the property seemed to amplify every sound, from the faint crackle of aged wood to the wind whispering through the garden trees. Dorian entered the study, drowning himself in work to compensate for the pain of mourning. When he wasn't with his son, he was immersed in piles of papers and documents that demanded his attention. He barely knew what he was working on. Numbers and words danced in his exhausted mind. Still, he forced himself to continue in a desperate attempt to keep his mind occupied and away from the painful memories that haunted him when he closed his eyes. The only light came from the lamp on his desk, creating a golden circle that barely illuminated the shadowy room. Shadows danced on the walls, appearing like restless figures watching his solitude. His eyes burned with tiredness, and his trembling right hand held a pen that had long ceased to write. "One more report," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from so much silence. "Just one more, and maybe I'll be able to sleep tonight." But he knew it was a lie. Sleep was merely another territory where Caroline found him, where the memory of her awaited with scenes from the past and the guilt he couldn't bury. He agonized over how he could have called out to her moments before she went upstairs, if he should have gone after her, and anything that could have prevented that tragedy. The clock on the wall read nearly midnight when something shifted in the air. It was just a breath at first, a subtle fragrance he would recognize anywhere. Caroline's true scent, that unique blend of roses and vanilla that always announced her presence even before she entered a room. Dorian froze. His fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard, and his heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. "I'm going mad," he thought, rubbing his tired face with his hands. "Longing is making me imagine things." But the perfume grew stronger, invading the space as if Caroline were there, just a few steps away. Dorian remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. He feared looking up, feared the emptiness. Yet the air felt heavier now, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. An almost imperceptible sound broke the silence, the soft rustle of fabric brushing against the carpet. The sound, delicate but unmistakable, made Dorian hold his breath. Finally he raised his eyes. His heart stopped for an instant. There, standing in the study's doorway, was Caroline. She wore the same blue dress she loved so much, the one he had bought her for a special anniversary. Her silhouette seemed almost ethereal, outlined against the darkness of the hallway. Shadows partially obscured her face, but Dorian didn't need more light. He would recognize that slight tilt of her head anywhere, under any circumstance. "Caroline." His voice came out as a trembling whisper, laden with disbelief and a hope he didn't know he could still feel. Time seemed to freeze as Dorian gazed upon the figure of his wife. She didn't move, didn't speak, only remained there like an apparition between the world of the living and the dead. The scent of roses now saturated the room, so real and present that Dorian could almost taste it in the air. His hand trembled as he slowly pushed his chair back, fearing that any sudden movement might make her disappear. Memories of the night of the accident surged like a storm. The sound of the breaking vase, the desperate screams, the panic that had taken hold of him. Dorian blinked rapidly, trying to push the images away. But the Caroline before him showed no sign of that violence. She looked intact as before, as if she had gone for a walk and just returned. "My love," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He finally found the strength to stand. "Is it really you?" Dorian took a hesitant step toward the door, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the house. Caroline remained motionless, but something in her posture shifted subtly, as if she too wanted to move closer. The space between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken emotions, with unanswered questions. He was about to take another step when Annalise's shrill voice cut through the moment like a knife. She appeared in the hallway, speaking loudly on the phone, her presence a violent intrusion upon the almost sacred scene. Yes, of course we can reschedule the meeting," she said, her artificial voice echoing off the walls. "Dorian has been so busy lately, you know how it is." The second Dorian took to avert his gaze from Caroline and look at Annalise was enough. When he turned his attention back to the door, Caroline had vanished. The space where his wife had stood seconds before was now empty, but the scent of roses lingered, a silent proof of her presence. Dorian felt a crushing emptiness in his chest, as if she had died again before his eyes. Annalise, noticing Dorian's troubled expression, interrupted her phone conversation. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice forcedly sweet. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She smiled, but the smile was laden with an insidious curiosity. Dorian stumbled back to his chair, his legs too weak to support him. He tried to light a cigarette, something he had promised Caroline he would never do again. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely strike the lighter. Annalise approached, her own perfume, that cheap imitation of Caroline's, trying to dominate the room. "You need to rest," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cold, mechanical. "You're working too hard. It's not good for you." It was then that Annalise noticed something strange in the hallway. In the dim light of the sconces, wet footprints marked the dark carpet. They were delicate feminine footprints, small like Caroline's. They began exactly where the figure had been standing and followed the corridor towards Caleb's room. Annalise felt her blood run cold as she followed the trail with her eyes. The night wind blew softly through the open windows, making the curtains dance like white ghosts in the darkness. The wet footprints glistened in the moonlight, each one perfectly formed, as if someone had just passed through there. Annalise approached the first mark slowly, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. She bent down to touch one of the footprints, her fingers trembling. The mark was real, wet and cold, as if someone had just come in from a long walk in the rain. The hallway seemed longer and darker than usual as Annalise followed the trail of footprints. They continued, relentless, towards Caleb's room, each mark a silent accusation of his crimes. The scent of roses still hung in the air, growing stronger with every step she took. Annalise, at Caleb's bedroom door, paused for a moment, trying to catch her breath and regain control. The persistent perfume, the curtains dancing in the wind in a house where no window was open. "It's just my imagination," she whispered softly before turning the knob with a decisive motion. "Wake up, Caleb," she called, trying to maintain the forced sweetness she always used to mask her true intentions. "I need to talk to—" The words died in her throat as her eyes met the empty bed. The room was immaculately tidy, the sheets perfectly smooth, as if no one had been there. Annalise took a few steps forward, the sense of unreality growing as she noticed Caleb's pajamas, folded on the pillow with a precision she knew the boy would never have. Her hands moved automatically, touching the cold fabric of the bed, as if the contact could provide some explanation. No, she murmured, her voice almost inaudible as control began to slip through her fingers. "This can't be happening." Panic rose in her throat like bile as she ran to the bathroom adjoining the room. The cold light of the mirror reflected only her pale face and wide eyes. Empty, she thought, her mind insisting on categorizing every detail as if a logical explanation would emerge. The closet was equally untouched, all of Caleb's clothes hanging neatly and his shoes perfectly aligned. Annalise spun on her heels, returning to the room and scanning it with wild eyes, searching for any sign of where the boy might be. "Caleb!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls like an accusation. "This isn't funny. Where are you?" The silence that answered her shout was deafening. There were no muffled giggles of a hidden child, no sound of light footsteps running to a new hiding place. Annalise ran down the hallway, violently opening doors, slamming them against the walls as she searched every room for the boy. "Caleb," she insisted, her voice carrying a note of desperation even she hadn't expected. "Please, come out. Your aunt is getting worried." The library, always Caleb's refuge, was empty. The books remained neatly arranged on the shelves, the chairs untouched. The game room, his second favorite place, was equally deserted, as if the boy had never set foot there. Annalise felt the ground beneath her feet seem less solid, as if the world around her was unraveling. The heavy air of the mansion seemed to close in on her, making each step a monumental effort. The stairs were descended in a blur as she tried to continue the search. The kitchen was empty, the table intact. No signs that anyone had touched anything. In the living room, the marks of the footprints that had disturbed her were now just a faint shadow on the carpet. The back door remained locked, the key motionless in the lock. Annalise scanned the windows with her eyes, checking the locks and curtains again. Everything was in order, as it should be, but it made no sense. He couldn't just disappear, she thought, her mind struggling to find any explanation that wouldn't drive her insane. When she finally climbed back up the stairs, her legs were wobbly, her feet heavy, as if stuck in quicksand. Tears began to roll down her face, smearing the makeup she had so carefully applied that morning. How? She whispered to herself, her voice almost drowned out by sobs. How could he have vanished? All the doors are locked, the windows closed. The sound of the study door opening interrupted her thoughts. Annalise froze at the top of the stairs, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dorian approached, his haggard appearance betraying that he was still shaken by the vision of Caroline. He fixed his tired eyes instantly on Annalise's desperate figure. "What happened?" he asked, climbing the steps two at a time, concern evident in his voice. "Did something happen to Caleb?" Annalise tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. How could she explain the inexplicable? How could she admit they had lost a child inside a completely locked house? I don't know," she stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to gesture uselessly towards the room. "He was in bed, I'm sure. I checked. But now..." Dorian didn't wait for further explanation. He rushed past her like a bolt of lightning, entering his son's room and stopping abruptly as he took in the scene before him. The perfectly made bed, the precisely folded pajamas, the complete absence of Caleb. He spun on his heels, facing Annalise with a mixture of anger and panic. "How is this possible?" His voice was a growl. "How could he have vanished like that?" Before Annalise could respond, a soft sound broke the silence of the corridor. Both turned, their wide eyes fixed on the emptiness. Dorian advanced, calling for Caleb, while Annalise stumbled back into the room. She felt her legs give way and fell to her knees beside the bed, clutching her nephew's pajamas, as if that could offer some answer. It was then that she felt it, that perfume, stronger than ever, filling the room with an intensity that made her choke. The scent of roses dominated the environment, and Dorian also perceived it, stopping abruptly in the hallway and looking at Annalise with an expression of recognition and horror. "Caroline," he whispered, almost inaudible, as if speaking her name could summon her again. "What is happening here?" Annalise could barely breathe as the perfume intensified, her hands trembling so much that the pajamas slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. The fragrance seemed like a living presence, something that surrounded her, mocking her inability to control the situation. "She can't be here," she murmured, her voice breaking in despair. "She's dead. I know she's dead." The wind blew softly, making the curtains dance in an almost hypnotic way. Caroline's perfume seemed to permeate the walls, the carpet, the very air, as if wanting to make it clear that she had never really left. Dorian fell to his knees beside the bed, his hands clutching the sheets as silent tears streamed down his face. "Where are you, son?" he whispered, his voice laden with pain. "What is happening in this house?" Annalise slowly backed away to the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. She no longer had answers, no longer had control. Her back hit the wall of the hallway, and she slid to the floor, finally broken. The control she had maintained for so long, the mask of perfection she had built so carefully, crumbled under the weight of that perfume that should no longer exist. The police investigation dragged on for endless hours, each minute gnawing at Dorian and Annalise's nerves. The Aldridge mansion, once a symbol of power and security, now seemed a scene of mystery and helplessness. The detectives, with faces marked by fatigue, scoured every corner, inspected locks and interviewed the employees with incisive questions that, deep down, brought no answers. Annalise watched it all with growing tension, her fingers drumming on the arm of the sofa as she maintained a forcedly calm demeanor. Dorian, on the other hand, seemed like a man on the verge of collapse. His eyes moved rapidly, searching every face for a solution that no one seemed able to offer. "There are no signs of break-in or violence," concluded the lead detective, closing his notebook with a tired sigh. He cast an empathetic glance at Dorian, though he knew his words would not be enough. "But we will keep looking. Children don't just disappear like that." Dorian hardly heard. His mind was immersed in a labyrinth of dark thoughts, exploring terrible scenarios. The vision of Caroline the night before and Caleb's inexplicable disappearance seemed connected by a logic he could not understand. He stood up abruptly, grabbing the car keys from the side table. "I can't just stand here," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Annalise tried to intervene, her hand reaching out toward him, but he ignored her. "I need to look for my son." Outside, the afternoon sun scorched the city streets, but Dorian hardly noticed the oppressive heat. He walked aimlessly, his gaze fixed on every face he crossed. Every child he saw, every street corner he turned, brought a spark of hope that quickly extinguished. His heart ached as he passed the places he frequented with Caleb, the ice cream parlor where they laughed together on Sundays, the bookstore where the boy devoured stories, the park where Caroline used to push him on the swing. Each location was a cruel reminder of the void that now consumed him. "Where are you, son?" he murmured repeatedly, like a desperate prayer. "Please, give me a sign." It was then that his eyes caught something that made him stop. In the window of a dress shop, a familiar reflection stared back at him. Dorian blinked, believing his mind was playing tricks on him, but the image did not disappear. It was Caroline, her figure silhouetted against the golden light of the afternoon. His heart stopped. Every detail was perfect, from the way her hair fell over her shoulders to the elegance of her movements. "Impossible," Dorian whispered, his entire body trembling. "It can't be." Without hesitation, he began to follow her. Each step seemed laden with memory, a blend of nostalgia and despair. Caroline's figure walked among the passers-by with the same grace he loved so much. Dorian quickened his pace, fearing he might lose sight of her. The scent of roses enveloped him before he could even reach her. It was the same aroma he had sensed the night before, so real that it could not be a figment of his imagination. "Caroline!" he shouted, his voice finally breaking the knot in his throat. "Caroline, wait!" She stopped. Her silhouette against the soft afternoon light seemed almost ethereal. Dorian stood still for a moment, his heart pounding with anticipation. Finally, she began to turn, each of her movements slow, as if time had slowed down to make the moment even more agonizing. First came the profile, then the delicate outline of her neck, until she was fully facing him. Dorian's world stopped. Caroline was there, alive, but not quite as he remembered her. Her face was marked by scars he had not noticed, forming a map of pain. The marks seemed to scream the truth of the night she had died, but it was her eyes that held him captive. They were the same, filled with love and sadness, conveying a story that words could never express. "Dorian," she whispered, her voice echoing like an old, familiar melody. "My love." Dorian felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. Reality and the impossible collided before him. His legs grew weak as the truth hit him squarely. Caroline was alive, scarred, marked by what had happened, but alive. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Everything seemed to spin around him, and darkness began to take over his vision. "Caroline," was all he managed to whisper, before passing out on the sidewalk. Across the street, Annalise watched the scene unfold, having followed Dorian without his knowledge. Her eyes fixed on Caroline were a mixture of horror and fury. She barely noticed the coffee cup in front of her, her nails digging painfully into her palm. Every detail of the woman who had destroyed her plans was an affront. Annalise knew those scars, those marks that should have been Caroline's definitive end. "So you survived," she muttered, her low voice dripping with hatred. But not for long. The crowd began to form around the now unconscious Dorian on the sidewalk. People approached, concerned, as Caroline knelt beside him, calling his name. Annalise remained where she was, her eyes never leaving the figure of her sister. "You should have stayed dead," she thought, each word laced with venom. "But don't worry, dear sister, I'll correct that mistake." Sirens began to echo in the distance, announcing the arrival of an ambulance. Annalise watched intently as Caroline rose, her figure disappearing into the crowd seconds before the paramedics arrived. It was as if Caroline was a ghost, dissolving into the golden light of the afternoon. Annalise's carefully constructed mask of perfection was in ruins, but where there was fury, a plan was born. She knew what needed to be done. Caroline was alive, and surely Caleb was with her. "You want to play, little sister?" Annalise murmured, a cruel, calculated smile forming on her lips. "Then let's play." The silence in the hospital was broken only by the constant beep of heart monitors and the distant whisper of voices in the hallway. Every sound seemed amplified in the room, where Dorian lay in a state between sleep and consciousness. His pale face contrasted with the shadows cast by the machines monitoring his vitals. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very air carried the weight of the past 24 hours. Dorian repeatedly murmured Caroline and Caleb's names, his dry lips barely able to form the words. His hands occasionally moved in the void, trying to grasp something invisible. "It wasn't a dream," he insisted in whispers. "I saw her. She's alive. Is Caleb with her?" Meanwhile, on the other side of the hospital, two figures moved silently through the near-deserted hallways. Caroline held Caleb's hand firmly, their fingers intertwined, passing a sense of security, though her mind was on high alert. Her face was partially covered by a scarf, hiding the scars that marked her skin as reminders of her supposed death. She looked from side to side with every step, her green eyes filled with worry. "We need to be quick," she whispered to Caleb. "Your aunt cannot find us here." Caleb, torn between relief at being with his mother and fear of the situation, did not respond. As soon as they entered the room, he let go of her hand and ran to the bed. His small hands found Dorian's, who slowly opened his eyes as if struggling to emerge from a nightmare. His son's touch was real, and Dorian could hardly believe it. "Caleb," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Then his eyes moved to Caroline, who stood out in the dimness of the room. Her figure seemed unreal, almost ethereal, but the scent of roses confirmed her presence. "Don't leave me again," Dorian pleaded, tears streaming freely. "Please tell me this is not a dream." Caroline slowly approached, the scarf falling slightly as she leaned in to touch Dorian's face. Her scars glistened in the soft light, but there was no bitterness in her eyes, only tenderness. "We're here now," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "And we'll never be separated again. Everything will be resolved soon, my love." Caleb nestled between them, feeling safe for the first time since the start of this nightmare. The momentary peace was interrupted by a knock on the door. A doctor entered, his expression of surprise evident as he saw Caroline. "Mrs. Aldridge," he called, his voice hesitant as he consulted his clipboard. "I need to speak with you about your husband's condition. In private, please." Caroline hesitated, her eyes going to Caleb before nodding. "Stay with your father," she whispered to her son, kissing his forehead. "I'll be back in a minute." Caroline had barely left the room when Annalise appeared in the hallway, moving with a frightening determination. Her eyes, shining with fury, found the door to the room. She opened it with a violent motion, entering like a storm. With a bang, she locked the door behind her, the sound echoing in the silence like a harbinger of danger. Dorian tried to sit up, but the medication and physical weakness kept him bound to the bed. Annalise advanced with firm steps, each movement charged with hatred. "So this is where you've been hiding," she hissed, her dark eyes fixed on Caleb, who shrank beside his father. The happy family reunited again. Caleb, sensing the danger, tried to back away, but Annalise was already beside him. Her hands closed around her nephew's arm with force, eliciting a scream of pain. "You should have died with your mother," she snarled, her words dripping with venom. "Now I'll correct that mistake." She pulled him violently, tearing him from the bed. Dorian struggled against the tubes and wires connecting him to the medical equipment, desperate to reach his son. "Annalise, no!" he yelled, his voice weak. "Please don't hurt my son." Annalise laughed, a cold and inhuman sound. "How you think you can stop me?" she said, dragging Caleb to the door. "If I can't have you, Dorian, then no one will. I'll end you all." Caleb cried silently, his tears streaming as he struggled to break free from his aunt's cruel grip. "Please, Auntie," he sobbed. "Why do you hate us so much? Mum never wanted to hurt you." The boy's words were like gasoline poured on the fire of her madness. Annalise paused for a moment, her hands trembling, but the hatred in her eyes intensified. "Your perfect mother," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "Always so good, so loved. She stole everything from me. But now I'll make sure she loses everything too." Annalise dragged Caleb down the empty hallway to the emergency stairwell door. She kicked it open, the metallic sound echoing through the confined space. The smell of metal and disinfectant filled the air as she shoved the boy down the stairs. Caleb stumbled, nearly falling, but Annalise held him by the hair, forcing him to continue. "You'll see what pain is," she snarled, her face a mask of madness. "You and your mother will pay for every moment I've lost." Suddenly, the scent of roses filled the space, so strong it felt like a physical presence. Annalise halted, her grip on Caleb loosening. The boy, bewildered, looked around, his eyes widening when he saw Caroline standing at the base of the stairs. His mother was motionless, but her presence was overwhelming. The scars on her face glowed under the emergency lighting, and her green eyes burned with an intensity Caleb had never seen. "Let him go," Caroline said, her voice low but heavy with authority. The air in the stairwell seemed heavier, as if every molecule was turning against Annalise. For a moment the woman froze, fear evident on her expression. Caroline took a step forward, each movement radiating a quiet strength. "You tried to kill me," she said, her words cutting the air like blades. "But here I am, and I won't let you hurt my son." The scent of roses grew even stronger, enveloping Caleb like a protective cloak. He pulled away from Annalise, running into his mother's arms. Annalise stumbled back, her back slamming against the wall. The sound of footsteps echoed from the upper floors, indicating the confrontation was about to draw attention. But Caroline didn't break her gaze, her eyes locked on Annalise's. "It's over, Annalise," she said, her voice steady. "It's done." The sound of doors opening on the upper floors filled the air, but no one in the stairwell moved. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a storm. The final showdown between the Aldridge sisters was about to begin. Caroline took a deep breath, trying to maintain control over the emotions that threatened to overflow. She took another step forward, slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wild animal about to attack. "You're wrong, Annalise," she said, her voice firm but laden with profound sadness. "It was never about beauty or preference. It was about choices. You chose hate. You chose bitterness, and now you're choosing to hurt an innocent child." Annalise took a step back, dragging Caleb with her. Her eyes showed a mixture of madness and fear as she watched her sister and Dorian slowly moving to surround her. "Stay where you are," she shouted, shaking Caleb violently. "Don't come any closer, or I'll throw him down the stairs. I want you to feel the same pain I've felt all these years." Dorian extended his hand, trying to approach without frightening her further. "Annalise, please," he pleaded, his voice choked with emotion. "It doesn't have to be this way. There's still time to make things right." But his words didn't reach Annalise. Her eyes shone with an irrational fury, her body trembling as she held Caleb like a shield. It was at that moment that the boy, moved by the survival instinct, acted. With a sudden impulse, he sank his teeth into Annalise's arm with all the strength he could muster. Her scream of pain echoed through the stairwell, and her grip loosened for a crucial instant. Caleb twisted his body, escaping his aunt's clutches and running toward his mother. Caroline received him in her arms, holding him tight as the scent of roses seemed to envelop them like a protective mantle. Annalise, realizing she had lost control, let out a cry of fury that sounded more like the roar of a wounded animal. Her eyes fixed on Caroline, now filled with a desperate determination. "If I can't have what I want," she screamed, advancing like a storm, "you won't have it either." Caroline pushed Caleb into Dorian's arms, who held him instinctively. She positioned herself between them and Annalise, her fists clenched, ready for impact. But Annalise, blinded by fury, didn't notice the steps right behind her. Her foot slipped, and what should have been an attack turned into an uncontrolled fall. Her body spun in the air, her arms flailing in a futile attempt to grab onto something. Annalise's eyes widened in surprise and terror as gravity inexorably pulled her down. The sound of doors opening echoed through the floors as nurses finally arrived at the stairwell. But it was too late. Annalise's scream echoed through the stairwell as she fell. By reflex, she managed to grab the railing a few steps down, partially cushioning her fall. Still, her body rolled violently down the stairs, until hitting the lower landing with a dull thud. She remained conscious, moaning in pain, her eyes still fixed on Caroline with a mixture of hatred and defeat. Doors opened on several floors as nurses and security guards finally reached the stairwell. Caroline hugged Caleb and Dorian, her arms trembling with the adrenaline of the moment. The scent of roses enveloped them like a protective shield as the medical team rushed to attend to Annalise. "It's over," Caroline whispered, kissing her son's forehead and holding her husband's hand. "It's finally over." Police officers surrounded the family, asking questions and taking notes, while the medical team stabilized Annalise a few floors below. She had broken several ribs and her right arm in the fall, but she would survive. The echo of sirens reached them, muffled, mingling with the murmur of professional voices discussing emergency procedures. Caleb clung to his mother, his small body still trembling, but his eyes already showed the relief of someone who knows the nightmare has finally ended. Caroline watched as the paramedics immobilized Annalise on a stretcher, ready to take her to the surgical center. Her sister had lost everything, not only the physical battle, but also any chance of feigning innocence. Now, with witnesses to her attempt to hurt Caleb and all the evidence Caroline had gathered, Annalise would face the consequences of her actions. "She needs help," Caroline murmured, her voice devoid of anger. "Maybe now, finally, she can get the treatment she needs." Caleb snuggled closer to his mother's chest, his little hands firmly grasping her shirt. Dorian held them protectively, creating a barrier between his family and the chaos unfolding on the stairwell. The sun was starting to rise, its first rays penetrating through the hospital windows, promising a new beginning for the Aldridge family. Hours later, the soft light of dawn entered through the windows of the hospital room, casting golden hues over the scene of newly restored tranquility. Dorian rested on the bed, his chest rising and falling in a calmer rhythm. By his side, Caleb slept curled up in an armchair, his tiny fingers still clutching a piece of his father's sheet as if to make sure he was there, safe. Caroline, sitting on the edge of the bed, watched the two with a look that mixed relief and exhaustion. Her hands, trembling from the previous night's adrenaline rush, were intertwined with Dorian's, while the scent of roses filled the room with a comforting presence. The scars on Caroline's face caught the morning light, shining softly, transforming into marks of strength and resilience. Each one told a part of the story she needed to share. She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts before speaking. "Are you ready to hear what happened?" Caroline asked, her voice low and hesitant. Her green eyes met Dorian's, which, even with the evident weariness, were filled with love and curiosity. "I need you to understand why I did what I did." Dorian slowly adjusted himself in the bed, ignoring the pain that still radiated through his body. He never averted his gaze from Caroline, as if fearing she might disappear again. His hands, still slightly trembling, rose to touch his wife's face, gently tracing the scars he knew were proof of her survival. "Why didn't you look for me before?" His voice faltered, laden with emotion. "I would have protected you, would have faced anything for you." Caroline gently silenced him, placing a finger over his lips. "I know," she said, her voice filled with tenderness and regret. "But I had no proof. It would have been my word against Annalise's. I couldn't risk it. I needed concrete evidence against her." Dorian closed his eyes, absorbing the words as his heart tightened at the memory of the misplaced trust. With a quick glance at Caleb, who continued to sleep deeply, Caroline began her narrative. Her voice was calm but full of emotion, each word carrying weight as she described the night of the accident. "I remember the moment I fell," she began, the words seeming harder than she imagined. "But what stuck most was Annalise's look. It wasn't an accident. She pushed me." Dorian gripped Caroline's hands tighter, his jaw clenched in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I didn't see," he muttered, more to himself. "I should have realized." Caroline gently shook her head. "You couldn't have known. Annalise has always been a master of manipulation. Even I took years to realize how dangerous she was." She continued, describing how she woke up in the hospital, covered in injuries and surrounded by uncertainty. It was then that she overheard Annalise's voice in the hallway talking to the doctors. "I was in the hospital. The doctors had admitted me, and I could hear her repeatedly asking if I would survive," Caroline recounted, her voice growing softer. "But it wasn't concern. It was fear. Fear that I might live." The fragments of memory that started returning to Caroline at that moment were enough for her to understand the gravity of the situation. She knew that if Annalise found out she was alive, she would do anything to finish what she had started. And worse, Caroline continued, her voice trembling slightly, she would use Caleb to get to me. I couldn't let that happen. It was then that nurse Laura entered her life. Caroline described how Laura, a stranger who had no reason to help her, became her ally. This is Laura, the nurse who helped me. She sensed something in Annalise's behavior, Caroline explained. Something that made her question her intentions. And when I told her the truth, Laura risked everything to help me disappear. Caroline spoke about the days she spent in a private clinic, recovering in secret as she tried to plan her next move. The physical pain was terrible, she admitted, looking at her hands, which still bore signs of her struggle. But nothing compared to the pain of knowing Caleb thought I was dead, that you were alone, vulnerable to Annalise's manipulations. But I thought if she believed I had died, she would leave you alone. She went on, explaining how she used the network of trust Laura had built to receive information about her family. Every day was a mixture of relief and suffering, Caroline said, her voice faltering as tears filled her eyes. Knowing you were okay gave me strength, but knowing Annalise was living in our home after everything she did, it destroyed me. Dorian listened in silence, each word sinking into his mind like a blade. He felt torn between gratitude for Caroline's survival and guilt for not realizing sooner what was happening around him. Caroline, sensing the turmoil of emotions in her husband, touched his face again. You couldn't have known, she repeated, and I never blamed you. Caroline then explained her appearances, the carefully chosen moments for Caleb to know he wasn't alone. The first time was at the cemetery, she revealed, her voice soft as she looked at her sleeping son. Annalise left him there alone, and I couldn't bear to see him in that horrible place. But I couldn't reveal myself fully. It wasn't safe yet. I had Laura bring my son home. She admitted that using her perfume was a calculated strategy. I wanted Annalise to start doubting her own sanity and confess everything. I tried recording her, but it was useless, she said with a small smile. I knew it would weaken her, make her make mistakes. Dorian couldn't help but feel a mixture of admiration and sadness for her courage. Caroline continued, describing how she meticulously documented every act of cruelty by Annalise, every moment of psychological abuse she inflicted on Caleb. I was building a case, she explained, her voice firm. Something so solid not even she could escape. The plan was nearly complete when Caroline realized Annalise was losing control. I should have anticipated she would try something desperate, Caroline admitted, guilt in her voice. When I realized she would do something to Caleb, I knew I had waited too long. My son was in danger, and nothing else mattered. So, I took him. The memory of the staircase made Dorian shudder. He closed his eyes for a moment, reliving the panic of that confrontation. When he opened them again, his hands were gripping Caroline's tighter. You saved us, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You risked everything for us. Caroline smiled, though tears streamed down her face. You're my family, she said simply. I would do it all over again if I had to. Caleb mumbled something in his sleep, stirring in the armchair, and they both looked at him with infinite love. The silence that followed was comfortable, laden with mutual understanding. Dorian finally broke the silence, pulling Caroline closer. You're amazing, he said, his voice steady despite the tears. And now that we're together again, nothing will separate us. The sun fully rose on the horizon, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. The nightmare was finally over, and the Aldridge family could begin to heal. Caroline knew there was still a long road ahead, but in that moment, with Dorian and Caleb by her side, she felt it had all been worth it. The Aldridge mansion seemed different when Dorian finally returned home, a week after the incident on the hospital staircase. Caroline and Caleb helped him up the entry steps, the same ones where it had all begun weeks before. The scent of roses now brought comfort instead of mystery, and Caroline's scars shone in the sunlight as a silent reminder of her strength. It's strange, Dorian murmured, pausing for a moment to gaze at the staircase. Everything looks the same, yet so different. Caleb squeezed his father's hand tighter, while Caroline gently guided them inside. That same afternoon, Caroline met with the police in her office. On the mahogany desk, She carefully laid out several folders, a notebook, and various documents, all the material she had collected during her time away. The audio recordings revealed disturbing conversations from Annalise from the night of the accident to her suspicious interactions with Caleb. It wasn't easy gathering all this, Caroline explained, opening the first folder. Every piece of evidence needed to be irrefutable, so she could never threaten us again. The photographs were particularly disturbing. Annalise tampering with the accident scene, her obsessive visits to Caroline's fake grave, moments when she mistreated Caleb when she thought no one was watching. The investigators were impressed by the meticulousness of the material. Caroline had documented everything, from precise timings to transcripts of conversations. Most importantly, she said, showing a specific set of photos, are the images from the night of the accident. The security cameras captured the exact moment she altered the rug's position, but they didn't catch my fall. Caleb remained close to his parents throughout the evidence presentation, his little fingers intertwined with his mother's. The therapists had advised including him in the family's healing process, as long as it was age-appropriate. "Is Auntie Annalise hurt like you were, Mummy?" he asked, his small voice carrying a mixture of fear and concern. Caroline hugged him tightly, her scars glistening in the afternoon light. "Yes, sweetheart, but she's going to get better too. And then she'll get the help she needs." News about Annalise's condition arrived daily through the lawyers. She was recovering under heavy police surveillance at a different hospital. The fractures from her fall would require months of recovery, and the doctors had already recommended psychiatric evaluation. "She'll survive," the lead detective informed during his visit. "But she'll answer for all her actions. The attempted murder, Caleb's kidnapping, everything." Caroline dedicated her mornings to organizing the material for the legal proceedings. The afternoons were reserved for Caleb, precious moments where mother and son reconnected through stories, garden playtime, and conversations about difficult feelings. Dorian often watched them, marveling at his family's strength. "You saved us all," he said one night, embracing Caroline as they watched Caleb sleep. Not just from Annalise, but from a life of lies. Caroline worked tirelessly with the prosecutors, ensuring every piece of evidence was perfectly documented. "It's not about revenge," she explained to Dorian. "It's about justice and protection. We need to make sure she receives the treatment she needs, away from people she could hurt." Caroline's scars began to lighten slightly, just as the emotional marks on Caleb seemed to soften with time and therapy. The boy returned to school, where Caroline's constant presence at the gate, alive and smiling, was the best remedy for his residual fears. "Mommy," he said one day, gently touching her face, "your scars are beautiful. They show you fought for us." Dorian also began his own therapy, working to overcome the guilt of not recognizing the danger Annalise represented. Caroline supported him unconditionally, sharing more details about how she had planned every move during her time away. "You couldn't have known," she consoled. Annalise spent a lifetime perfecting her mask of perfection. The mansion gradually became a home again. Caroline personally oversaw the redecorating, removing every trace of the changes Annalise had made. Caleb's room got brighter colors, and the library returned to being a sanctuary of peace and knowledge, no longer a place of hideouts and secrets. "Each room has a different story now," Dorian observed. "A story of starting over." The evidence was abundant and irrefutable, from the audio recordings to the testimonies of the witnesses who had helped Caroline. Nurse Laura, in particular, provided a detailed account of Annalise's suspicious behavior on the night of the original accident. "There's no way she's getting out of this one," the prosecutor assured. "Her future will be decided by her own actions." The scent of roses became just a scent again, no longer an omen or a ghostly presence. Caroline wore it freely now, its aroma filling the house with happy memories instead of mystery and fear. Caleb often asked to spritz some on his pillow before bed. "So I know you're always with me, Mummy," he explained, snuggling into his covers. The news that Annalise would be transferred to a maximum security prison after her recovery brought a silent relief to the family. Caroline received the information with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "Maybe there," she said to Dorian, "my sister will finally find justice." Dorian went back to work but now spent more time at home, savoring every moment with his recovered family. Nights were filled with family dinners, bedtime stories, and heartfelt conversations about feelings and fears. Caroline and Caleb were not the only ones with scars to heal, but together, the Aldridges were building something stronger than ever. "We are survivors," Caroline declared one night, embracing her family, "and now we are truly free." Life gradually found its new normal. Investigations continued. Legal processes followed their course, and the Aldridge family healed one day at a time. Caroline knew there was still a long road ahead, but looking at her husband and son, she was certain every sacrifice had been worth it. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in golden hues, promising a brighter tomorrow for everyone. The Aldridge mansion had undergone a complete transformation with the arrival of spring. The garden, now filled with colorful flowers, was Caleb's favorite place to play, while Caroline and Dorian watched him from the porch. Caroline's scars shone under the afternoon sun, but now they were just part of her beauty, marks of a story of love and courage that made the family stronger. "Look, Mommy," Caleb shouted from the garden, showing a blue butterfly that had landed on his hand. "It's not afraid of me." The library had become the heart of the house again, with its books neatly organized and comfortable pillows scattered in the corners. Caleb spent hours there with Caroline, rediscovering the joy of reading and shared stories. Dorian often found them asleep among the books, the son nestled in his mother's arms like in the old days. "They're so alike," he thought, watching their peaceful faces. "They have the same inner strength." Mornings at the mansion now had a different rhythm. Caroline prepared breakfast while Caleb helped, proud of his new responsibility to make perfect toast. Dorian watched them from the kitchen door, his heart overflowing with gratitude for these simple moments he had almost lost forever. "You are my entire life," he said, embracing the two of them. "My family, my home, my everything." Caleb returned to school with a renewed sparkle in his eyes. His grades improved, and teachers noticed how he seemed more confident and happy. Caroline dropped him off and picked him up every day, turning each journey into a special adventure where they shared secrets and laughter. "Did you know you're my best friend, Mommy?" he said one day, holding her hand on the way home. "And you're my little hero," she replied, kissing his forehead. Nights at the Aldridge mansion were now moments of peace and connection. The family dined together, sharing stories of the day and making plans for the future. Dorian had developed the habit of playing the piano after dinner, something he hadn't done in years, while Caroline and Caleb danced around the living room, their laughter echoing through the walls. "Music has always been in our hearts," said Caroline, twirling with Caleb. "We just needed to rediscover it." Weekends became special, with picnics in the garden and impromptu movie sessions in the living room. Caleb loved building forts with pillows and blankets, where the family would snuggle up to watch adventure movies. Caroline and Dorian took turns making up stories, each one adding more fantastical elements than the other, making Caleb laugh until he was breathless. "One more story, please," he begged every night. "Just one more." Dorian surprised the family with the news that he had reduced his workload at the office. "I realized what really matters," he explained during a special dinner. "No professional success is worth more than moments with you." Caroline squeezed his hand across the table, her eyes shining with tears of happiness, while Caleb celebrated the prospect of having more time with his father. Caleb's room received a new decor, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Caroline had painted a tree on the wall, and together they added a new leaf every time Caleb achieved a milestone or overcame a fear. "We'll need another tree soon, Mom," he said proudly, sticking on another leaf. "This one is getting full of victories." Caroline rekindled her passion for painting, transforming one of the empty rooms into a studio. Caleb often joined her, creating his own artworks alongside his mother. Dorian kept every drawing from his son like a treasure, decorating his office with the family's colorful creations. "Art is the language of the heart," Caroline would say, teaching Caleb how to mix colors. "And our hearts have a lot to say." Caroline's scars inspired Caleb to create a series of drawings he called Marks of Love. Each drawing showed different types of scars transformed into flowers, butterflies, and stars. "See, Mom," he explained, showing his work. "All marks can become something beautiful." Caroline framed the entire series, hanging it in the main hallway of the house. Dorian began working on more social projects, inspired by the strength of his own family. He created a foundation to help other families in difficult situations, with Caroline taking an active role in the organization. Caleb loved visiting the projects with his parents, distributing books and sharing smiles with other children. "Can we help everyone have a happy ending like ours?" he asked one day. "We'll try, my love," Caroline replied, proud of her son's compassion. The mansion's garden became a meeting point for small parties and gatherings with true friends. Caroline and Dorian made sure to surround Caleb with positive and loving people, creating a support network that extended beyond the mansion's walls. The laughter of children playing in the garden mingled with the lively conversations of adults, creating an atmosphere of genuine joy. Months later, the autumn sun illuminated the Aldridge mansion as guests arrived for Caleb's birthday party. His 9 years would be celebrated not only as another year of life, but as a victory, the first party since the family had reunited. Caroline watched her son running through the garden with his friends, his face lit up with pure joy that made her heart overflow with happiness. Dorian had transformed the garden into a miniature amusement park, with colorful tents, games, and a small outdoor library. Caleb's idea, who insisted on sharing his love of books with his friends. Caroline's scars, now almost silvery under the sunlight, were hardly noticed by the guests, who only saw the beauty of her smile as she organized the activities with her ever-contagious energy. Caleb's book, The Boy Who Found Courage, was displayed on a special table. The story, inspired by his own experiences but transformed into a fantastic adventure, had been published by a small local publisher and was already inspiring other children. Caroline and Dorian could not be prouder to see their son autographing copies for his little friends, his green eyes shining with satisfaction. The foundation created by Dorian had already helped dozens of families rebuild their lives. Caleb actively participated in social projects, always accompanied by Caroline, distributing books and sharing his passion for reading. The mansion's library had become an open space for community reading sessions on Saturdays, transforming a place once marked by difficult memories into a sanctuary of learning and hope. Caroline resumed her career as an artist, but with a new purpose. Her paintings, now exhibited in a small local gallery, told stories of overcoming and rebirth. Caleb had his own easel set up next to his mother's in the studio, and together they spent hours creating colorful worlds on the canvases, their laughter echoing through the studio walls. As the sun began to set and the garden lights automatically turned on, the Aldridge family gathered in front of the cake. Dorian embraced Caroline from behind, both watching Caleb close his eyes to make his wish. The boy smiled before blowing out the candles, but he didn't need to wish for anything. Everything he had ever wanted was there, in the love that united them and the strength they found in each other. "We're stronger together," Caleb whispered that night, nestled between his parents in his new bed after the party. Caroline kissed his forehead as Dorian stroked his hair, and the three shared a moment of silent gratitude for the path that had brought them there. The future lay ahead of them like a blank book, ready to be filled with new stories of love, courage, and hope. The Aldridge mansion still stands, imposing against the city's skyline, but its essence has changed completely. What was once a setting for tragedy has become a symbol of rebirth and hope. Caroline's scars, like the invisible marks Caleb and Dorian carry, are now just reminders of how strong they are together. Dorian found a new purpose beyond work, dedicating himself to helping other families through his foundation. Caleb grew up strong and secure, surrounded by his parents' unconditional love, transforming his experiences into stories that inspire other children. Caroline, on her journey as a mother and artist, proves daily that true beauty lies in the strength of love and the courage to start over. Together, the Aldridges not only survived but emerged from it more united and stronger, proving that love, when true, can overcome any obstacle. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.